Hello and welcome to The Way Home, Crossnore Communities for Children's Facebook Live show, as well as our podcast. I'm Holly Kessler, and I'm the Senior Director of Community Relations at Crossnore. We are here every Tuesday, or maybe even whatever day you're watching or listening, but we get to talk with some of our staff members or community partners about the work that we do, the child welfare system, creating trauma-resilient communities, and other ways that we're engaging in our community. So if you miss our live show, you can always rewatch on Facebook in our feed, or you can catch the show on our YouTube channel. The podcast comes out on Fridays on our blog at crossnore.org. So there are plenty of ways to watch our show each week, and we hope that you'll engage with us. Today's guest is David McCorkle. He is the co-founder of Crossnore Center for Trauma Resilient Communities. David's been with us a couple of times, and he's joining us today to continue a conversation we started a little while back about trauma-informed and resilient faith-based spaces. So join me in welcoming David back to the show. Hello, friend.
Good morning. Good morning, Holly. It's great to be here.
It's good to have you here. I'm so glad to see your face.
Thank you.
Well, David, introduce yourself for those folks who might be new and maybe have not seen you on the show before, and tell us about the Center for Trauma Resilient Communities.
So my full name is David McCorkle. I'm a clinical social worker. I live in New York City and have a private practice. And I'm from North Carolina, and I'm very familiar. I've spent time in the mountains at our Avery campus, and also in Winston-Salem professionally. And then in my youth, I spent a lot of time in those parts of North Carolina that were formative in my experience and definitely contributing to the topic that we're talking about today.
That is great. And so you're one of the co-founders of the center. Give us just a sentence or two about what the center does, what their work is.
So the mission of this center is to help communities outside of our agency, Crossnore Communities for Children, to have some understanding about the impact of adversity and trauma, and to create safer spaces, and to find best practices around helping people to stabilize and recover from trauma. Of course, our initial focus has always been on children and their families.
Right.
And I'll just say that the center happened because people started reaching out to us, when there would be church shootings or synagogue shootings, or communities had someone with PTSD from being in the armed forces. They didn't know how to help them, or if there was a disaster, or if they knew that a family was struggling. People just didn't have the tools and the knowledge of how to help people. And a lot of times people avoided trauma. And of course, when you avoid something, it just gets worse.
Yes, unfortunately, it does. You are so right. Well, I know that the center is really busy and working with lots of organizations and people and communities across the country. And so we are deeply grateful for that work. It is hard work, but it's super, super important. And so today, you and I are going to talk about something that's near and dear to both of our hearts.
That's true.
And that is our faith-based spaces. And I just wondered, why is this subject of trauma-informed and trauma-responsive faith spaces, why is that important to you personally?
Personally, because of my own, the resilient factors in my life were formed in church. And I had a lot of experiences, positive, as living in the country in North Carolina, and then in a small city, Burlington, and in New York. And in the times of struggle in my life, and I'm going to talk particularly about 9/11 and the AIDS pandemic, church was a safe, comforting, healing, helping space for myself and for many others.
Good.
I feel that sometimes we overlook. The reason I said faith-based spaces is, of course, we mean synagogues and mosques
Absolutely.
and all denominations. That these are great resources, and there's some good research around that too, as healing spaces. And we'll talk a little bit about how they can be hurtful spaces as well.
Yeah. So let's start by defining trauma. Trauma is a word that we hear sort of in popular culture a lot these days. But some people still may not really be aware of what trauma really is. So tell us what that definition is.
You're absolutely right. We say, we hear an ambulance and we might use the word trauma, and it gets overused. And I think the definition that I'm giving you today is a little different than maybe what I would have said a year ago.
Okay.
And one of the things about the center is that we stay abreast of all of the science which is emerging. So trauma, basically, this is a definition by Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score, which is a recommended book. And traumatization is when both internal and external resources are inadequate to cope with external threats. And that particularly focuses on trauma as an event or series of events. Some people, using are in on the places like Afghanistan and Iraq, and it was terrible and stressful, and they saw awful things, but they don't feel traumatized because they have. It's almost serendipitous. It's sort of how your brain processes something, and it's also that we can have resilient and protective factors. So once again, it's when you're completely overwhelmed and you feel helpless. And if you're in an accident and you can't get out, you're helpless. But if you're in an accident and you can get out, I would say that's probably not trauma because you're not helpless. But the piece I want to add on this morning is that we now think of trauma as not an event, but what happens after an event or a period of time where somebody is re-traumatized, and it's the experience of how trauma is stored in the body. So trauma affects your body. It's just not something that happens in your head and you have flashbacks, but it affects your entire body, mind, and I would like to add for our conversation, our spirit.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I think you've said a couple of important things. One is that we can't really determine, whether or not somebody has had trauma. In other words, what might be traumatic to you and I could experience kind of the same thing, and it might be a traumatic experience to you, but not to me, depending on our own resilience factors. And I think that's an important point because sometimes, maybe we hear somebody's story and we're like, well, that's not traumatic, but maybe it really was for them.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think that's a really, really important point. I appreciate your defining this and that experience of how it's stored in your body. And I think when you start to recognize that in your own self, like you can start to feel it when it begins. If you're starting to get triggered, you can recognize when that is happening in your own body.
Exactly. And I would like to also say that, there are collective traumas.
Yes.
I think that's apropos to say at this time after COVID that the pandemic for many people became traumatic because they were helpless. People, there were families where multiple people in the family died, and often died alone in a hospital because of contagion. And I think those are collective traumas. I think 9/11 in many ways was a collective trauma.
Absolutely.
And I think that historical trauma, we begin to talk a lot about historical trauma at the center. And of course, one of the most horrible examples of collective trauma was the history of racism and slavery in our country. So we help people to and racialized trauma. So we and developmental trauma, which is children who have had blocks and have been treated with violence in their development.
Yeah.
And complex trauma means that that it's multiple traumas and it happens over time and quite often in the context of a place that's supposed to be safe and secure, but isn't safe and secure.
Right, which I think really brings us back around to our topic today. So if we know that, people who come to faith-based spaces have experienced trauma elsewhere, but we also know that trauma can occur in those faith-based spaces that are supposed to be safe, but some of them aren't. So how do we really make our faith communities safe places so that they're not causing additional harm, but they're also that welcoming, safe place for folks who've experienced harm elsewhere?
I think that the first step, and this is always the hardest step, is facing it and recognizing that in our churches, synagogues, faith-based spaces, that there are people who have had traumatic experiences. There's domestic violence, there's sexual abuse. It certainly doesn't have to be church related. We know, of course, that there's been abuse within the church, but it can be outside the church, and people bring that to church. And Serenity Jones has written a book about, I think it's called Trauma and Grace, and she was in church. I think it's Disciples of Christ, and she was in church, and she noticed another person just, fighting back tears, manifesting, hurt, and she felt helpless. She didn't want to intrude, but she wanted to speak up and say that, I'm so glad you're here. We want this to be a welcoming and comforting place. So, sometimes we, in our spiritual spaces, we get wrapped up in ourselves, and that's okay. If we want to help others, we have to be strong in our faith and our spiritual life. And so sometimes we go inside, but sometimes people have been at church, and we hear many stories, and they've never, no one's ever said, "Are you okay?" And sort of the code of privacy. I'll go ahead and say it, especially in the South. At least my experience was that way. Don't ask, don't tell. Keep up appearances, all that stuff. Don't cry at funerals. That was part of my legacy. I used to say to my mom, one time I cried at a funeral. I mean, at home. And she said, "Oh, be brave." And I said, "Do you know how much that sentence has cost me in therapy? Be brave."
Oh my goodness.
So,
but I think what you're saying, practically speaking, is just acknowledging what somebody else is going through, whether that's a loss or a grief of some kind, or a trauma that they're experiencing. And I think we don't have to ask them to share the details, but just acknowledge that we see them and we see that they're struggling.
Exactly. And I think, that pastors and rabbis and others can also preach about trauma and adversity. And offer words of comfort. And if we're in a big church, we can offer, many big churches do offer spiritual help,
Mhm.
counseling.
Mhm.
Um, you know, I think grief is can be very traumatic,
Yeah.
and grief can be prolonged. And I think churches can be very, very effective to help people with their mourning.
Mhm.
I know
Mhm.
that Trinity Church, which is a big church in New York, has a lot of online groups, and in terms of grief and the pandemic, um, that's been very comforting for people to even go to that kind of group. And in
Mhm.
that group, they offer people, um, you know, that you can come and seek individual help. But
Mm.
there, you know, there are many ways in church. You know, some churches offer a sacrament of healing.
Mhm.
Some churches have healing healing groups. You know, when you think about,
Right.
remember that AA doesn't, it does meet in secular spaces, but AA was started in churches.
Started in churches. Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
right. That's
Absolutely.
that's where he went. So
Yeah. Yeah.
Al-Anon as well. So and
Absolutely.
probably the other recovery programs too,
Yeah.
including you know, sexually addicted people.
Yeah, and you often make the point, David, that faith-based communities carry a lot of hope in them, and so that helping folks sort of um, not glossing over their losses or their trauma, but looking for that hope, I think is important in helping them. And I also think we can lead the way. I always say that we talk about feelings a lot, and we all ask people, how are you feeling in our community meetings? And I always say good, fine, and okay are not feelings. Those are the words we say when we don't want to tell us how we're really feeling, right?
Exactly.
And so we can kind of lead the way, when not that we have to just dump on people, but we can be honest about how we're feeling, when somebody asks us, and not just retreat to, oh, I'm fine, when we're really not.
And I think it's what a good point, because you know, occasionally people you'll ask someone, maybe at church or synagogue, you'll say, how are you doing? And they will be comfortable enough to say, I'm really struggling.
Yeah.
And I don't want, you know, sort of the tip is, we don't have to say, um uh, you know, that's terrible, or you know, can I, do you need anything from me? I think it's just acknowledging it. So
Right.
it's maybe a little more than I hear you.
Mm-hmm.
um, and you know, maybe inviting somebody. I think churches can be intimidating, especially city
Mm-hmm.
churches.
Mm-hmm.
You go to a big church and somebody walks in the door, and you know how welcoming, it's actually sort of an art. How
Yeah.
welcoming are you? But how are you also not intrusive?
Right.
Because I've seen people come into sacred spaces, and you can sort of tell that what they need is a smile and a welcoming look, but they need to pray in that space.
Yeah.
And at St. Mark's in the Bowery, where I go to church, often we have a lot of homeless people who come into the church, and they're always welcome. I will say that around safety, it became the church has to be safe, and I
Absolutely.
think that's foundational. And Sunday school has to be safe. You know, the choir has to be safe. So we often don't talk about it. We just say, well, church, of course church is safe. But it's we could talk a little later about theological trauma. We could do a whole program on traumatizing theology. But we want to be aware, and give people space, because there are inherent factors in faith-based spaces. For example, music.
Yes.
Music is literally, um, now maybe if it's amped too much,
Right.
it might not be,
Right.
it will be good for the kids, uh, but music, actually, typical uh, church music, synagogue chanting, um, other chanting and other faiths, it actually calms the nervous system. I mean, you can actually, if you could do a scan, you would see when people sing responsively, uh, it's very calming to the nervous system. And
Yeah.
so singing is good for us. Hearing singing, hearing music, uh, being, the great mantra of is to be still and know that I am God.
Right. Right.
And those kind of mantras, you could walk into the old Presbyterian church of my grandparents. That was at the top. Be still and know that I am God.
Yeah. 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 That's a great quote and a great thing for us to focus on. So, David, when we are thinking about faith-based spaces, obviously they're communal spaces. And we talk sometimes about co-regulation when we're in community with one another. So can you explain to us, first of all, what does co-regulation mean? And then are there some faith-based practices that will promote that co-regulation?
So co-regulation is as simple as when I'm calm, it helps you to be calm. And all of us that have pets know that when we get anxious, the pet gets anxious. And so we actually have the ability, without using words or our any movement, to help other people feel safe. Because people that have had trauma are always, their radar is on,
Yeah.
and they're scanning for danger, and they can't help it. Because
Mm-hmm.
once you've experienced trauma and your boundaries have been breached, your body, even if your head says it's over, I'm safe now, I'm in a place where this can't happen again, but your body, it is still vigilant. It affects the nervous system. So some part of you scans for danger, and there might be some, a loud noise or hearing somebody shout that will trigger you, and you feel out of control. You might want to run. You might freeze. It's quite extraordinary. So that's why the calmer we are, and when we pray, we hopefully get peaceful. And to think about that in terms of worship, that's why, it's sort of old-fashioned, but worship used to start with some silence, or quite often in our church here, and I've heard it in other churches, the minister will say, let's take some time to quieten our hearts and silence our cell phones. Um, so, and quite often, there's a music meditation at the beginning. So that is the beginning of co-regulation.
Okay.
And when we just, that's why if we do more information in our faith-based spaces, we can really help people. People will say, I feel safe when I'm here.
Yes.
I feel calm. We've had people of all faiths and none come into church and say, this church, I'm not a Christian. We go, that's okay, but just being here makes me feel safe and calm. And occasionally people will be dysregulated. I've heard people in church, like if there's a baby crying, I've heard people go, could you keep that baby quiet? And that's a horrible, terrible, dreadful thing to do, because that dysregulates a lot of people.
Right. Right.
And so co-regulation, it means my calm will help you to be calm. And we know that at Crossnore, when a kid is all revved up, if we stay calm, it helps them to calm down.
Yeah. Yeah. And when we can make that connection, I'm thinking about back to your example of seeing somebody, in your congregation that, maybe clearly is upset, being able to sit down with them. And even if you don't say much, but you just acknowledge again that they are clearly going through something, and you just
Exactly.
sit with them. And
To-
that's
Maybe
a great
that's the
thing.
best thing. You just
Yeah.
sit, give them some space, but sit in a way that you acknowledge them, but you don't have to say a word. And there's a whole lot of theory. It's called the polyvagal theory, and actually
Mhm.
it's done by a professor at the University of North Carolina,
Yeah.
Stephen Porges.
Oh, yes. Yes. I'll put that that link in the show notes too for folks to read about that. Well, as always, we are quickly running out of time, but I did want to ask one other quick question before we end about protective outcomes. So what is it? We talk a lot about resilient factors or protective factors. And so what is it about a trauma-informed or trauma-resilient faith-based space that can add to our own protective factors?
Yeah, well, we know that I used the book, Lisa Miller's book, both The Spiritual Child and I'm forgetting the name of the second book, but it's about how prayer, just acknowledgement of higher power, is
Mm-hmm.
calming. Rituals,
Mm-hmm.
for people to have seders are huge. They change our makeup, and those are some of the resilient factors that faith-based spaces can offer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you
Is
so
that
much.
clear? Is that clear enough? Or
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think about, like we've talked a little bit about reducing anxiety, but even reducing depression, helping. I think faith-based spaces, as you mentioned before, about like recovery groups that started in churches, really helping folks, deal with their own, sort of addictions or struggles, whatever it is that they're struggling with. Just making that safe place for people to be who they are, has to be protective for them as they work to deal with the trauma that they've experienced. So, yeah, very, very clear. But before we go, do let folks know if they want to know more about the Center for Trauma Resilient Communities and about you guys, your particular work or how they might engage that work. Where can they find that out?
so they go to traumaresilient.org,
Yeah.
and or you can. I think we actually now have a phone number listed at traumaresilient.org,
Great.
and you can call and we can get you some information. And we would love to give presentations in churches, synagogues, mosques,
Absolutely.
meditation centers. We would like to talk about this work, and we think it can. It's part of our sense of giving back for all the blessings that we've received at Crossnore.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. So do contact the center if you're interested, and we'll be happy to come and talk with your group. David, thank you so much again for being with us
Thank
today. I
you
really
too,
appreciate
Holly.
it. Yeah. Well, friends, as I have thanked David for being with us today, let me also say thanks to each of you who are watching or listening. We always appreciate the opportunity to tell you about Crossnore, about the Center for Trauma Resilient Communities, and a lot of the work that we're doing. For more information, please visit our website at crossnore.org or follow us on our social media channels on Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn. That's it for today, but I hope you will join us again next week right here on The Way Home.